God? God? God, where are you? Have you seen God? Why is it that whenever I need God, God always seems like God's hiding from me?
Welcome. We're glad you're with us today, or night, whatever it is when you're watching this. I'm reading today from the 11th chapter of the Gospel according to John. The whole chapter is assigned for the Sunday, but I'm just going to read 3 pieces. Beginning in verse 1. Lazarus was sick. He was from Bethany, the same village as Mary and her sister Martha. Mary was the one who had anointed the Lord with expensive ointment and wiped his feet with her hair. Lazarus, who was sick, was her brother. The sisters sent to Jesus, saying, "Lord, the friend that you love is sick." When Jesus heard it, he said, "This sickness is not to the death, but rather it is for the glory of God, in order that the Son of God might be glorified through it." Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. But when he heard that Lazarus was sick, Jesus stayed where he was for 2 days. When Jesus came to Bethany, he found that Lazarus had been in the tomb for 4 days. Now, Bethany is not very far from Jerusalem, about 2 miles. So many Judeans had gone out to Martha and Mary to comfort them regarding their brother. When Martha heard that Jesus is coming, she went to meet him. Mary remained seated in the house. When Martha came near, she said to Jesus, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. Even now, though, I know that God will give you whatever you ask." Jesus said to Martha, "Your brother will rise." Martha said, I know that he will rise in the general resurrection on the last day." But Jesus said to her, "I myself am the resurrection and the life. Whoever has faith into me, even though they die, they will live. And everyone who lives and has faith into me will never, ever die for all eternity. Do you believe this?" Martha said, "Yes, Lord, I have already believed that you are the anointed Son of God who is coming into the world." When Jesus came near to the tomb, he was moved to the depths within himself. The tomb was a cave with a boulder sealing the opening. So Jesus said, "Take away the boulder." But Martha, the sister of the man who died, said, "Lord, it has been 4 days. There will be a horrible stench." Jesus said to her, "Did I not tell you that if you have faith, you will see the glory of God?" So they took away the stone. Then Jesus lifted up his eyes toward the sky, and he said, "Father, Abba, I give you thanks that you have already heard me. I know that you always hear me, but I'm saying this for the sake of those who are standing around, so that they might believe that you sent me." Having said this, Jesus shouted out in a loud voice, "Lazarus, come out!" And the dead man came out. His feet and his hands were wrapped, and his face was covered with a burial cloth. Jesus said to the people standing around, "Untie him and let him go." The Gospel of the Lord.
Gary, thanks for coming and being our guest today.
It's a pleasure.
The person last week was kind of a meanie, so I'm glad you're here.
I heard some bad things about him too.
Oh, you did?
I did.
Well, I'm really glad you're here then. So, can you tell me more about this text? And Jesus seems like he has no urgency to get to where he's going.
I think that is a key puzzle in the text. He does seem not to have urgency. And it's particularly interesting because the writer tells us specifically Jesus loved Martha and Mary and Lazarus. He's very close friends with them, and yet he doesn't go.
But if you loved somebody and they were in the hospital, you would go immediately, right?
I would.
Then what's Jesus doing here?
I think that is a key question. The only thing we can say is that Jesus says this is for the glory of God. That's really the only explanation that he ever gives. And he doesn't, when Martha confronts him, and really she's accusing him, when she says, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. That's not a gentle little saying. She is saying, hey, Jesus, what's with you? You're like 2 miles away. If you'd been here, this wouldn't have happened, but you didn't show up. And I think that's a question that can occur to us very easily when we find ourselves in times of maybe illness or a bad circumstance in life. Sometimes there are things that just come upon us in life. And a person can be pressed by affliction to saying, why doesn't Jesus come? I'm calling out, I'm praying. Why doesn't Jesus come? I remember being in a hospital room with a couple in their mid-40s. And the woman had just been told there wasn't anything more that could be done for her cancer. And the husband began to weep. He was weeping, tears just wrenched from his soul. And he suddenly said to me, Pastor, why won't God answer my prayers? I'm praying and praying, and apparently God doesn't listen to me. And now this is happening.
Is it okay for us to be angry at God?
It is, absolutely. Jesus doesn't in any way reproach Martha. He's not upset with Martha. She's clearly angry at him. But in addition, the Bible is filled with God's own people who sometimes get angry with God, and God doesn't respond by being angry. Being angry at God actually signifies that you're engaged with God. And that's the key, just to be engaged with God.
So what about the flood? Is God not angry with the people at that point?
Not for being angry. So what brings forth God's wrath is sin and unrighteousness. But anger is not classed as unrighteousness. If you remember in Ephesians, there is this line, be angry, but don't sin.
I think that we can all use that from time to time. Are you ever mad at God?
It's been a long, long time. I think I get less angry with God than I'm more inclined to continually heighten my demands that God should do what I want God to do when I'm in a bad circumstance.
So when you're in those bad circumstances, often it feels like God is kind of playing hide and seek with us, right? Like we want God to be right there, but it's really hard to find God. So where do you go to find God in those moments?
Well, that's a really, really good question. And I think the only place we finally can go is to God's own word, where God opens God's heart to us, where Jesus opens his heart to us. Apart from that word, we're staring at a blank wall. The eternal things of God are not open to us, to our investigation through reason or through intuition or any such thing. We have to cling to God's having spoken to us. So I want to go back to Jesus then. he makes this general statement to Martha, your brother will rise. And Martha sort of says, yeah, I know all about the resurrection in the last day and all of that. And then Jesus says he's really saying something different. Jesus says, no. I'm actually not talking about some kind of general resurrection, and I'm not talking about an abstraction or a concept even. Jesus says, I myself, my person, I am the resurrection and the life. And whoever has faith into me, even though they die, they will live. If they live and have faith into me, they will never, ever die. Do you believe this? What he's really saying at bottom is, Martha, you're going to have to trust me. You're going to have to trust me in the dark.
So you've been talking a lot about this word resurrection. Sometimes it applies to us, and sometimes it applies to Jesus. How does that work?
Put most directly, our resurrection is totally dependent on Jesus. His having been raised, and then this saying, I am the resurrection. So for us, there is no resurrection for us apart from him. And our resurrection really amounts to a promise and assurance that if we are bound to him by faith, we will share his destiny. We'll share his resurrection, and we'll share his life.
So at the end of the gospel message today, Lazarus is raised from the dead. It kind of seems like something out of the movie The Mummy, not really something out of real life. Is that really something that can happen, or is that just fantasy?
That is a great question, and I think it's a stumbling block for many people when they're reading the New Testament, thinking about a thing like Lazarus' resurrection or thinking about the resurrection of Jesus. That is just not a thing that's part of our experience. Dead people do not rise up. Within our mathematics and physics and biology and chemistry, that is not a possibility. It doesn't appear even to be plausible in any way. But part of the problem is we have a tendency to think about God in the wrong way, which it causes us also to think about Jesus in the wrong way. We almost can't help it, but we tend to think about God as if God is inside the system of the world, inside the mathematical laws and principles, the laws of physics, biology, and chemistry, as if God is one entity, let's say, and I don't like that word, but one entity among all these other entities. It's just that God has the most power, or God has the most magnificence or something. And that actually might go for pagan gods. That probably would be a descriptor for Zeus or Thor or Odin, but not for the biblical God.
What's the difference between Zeus and God?
Zeus and the pagan gods are inside the system of the world. They're subject to the same laws of mathematics and physics and so on. It's just that they have much, much more power and they're immortal. But for the biblical God is outside this whole system. The biblical God created the universe out of nothing except God's own will. And what we would call the mathematical laws, the blueprints that are really the foundation of the created order and that run the universe, the laws of physics that run the way things are, the functions of biology and chemistry that are basic to the functioning of the universe, God stands outside those, and in fact, God is the condition of the possibility of those conditions. So God, therefore, is not inside, and God is not in any way bound by any of those formulas or what we would call laws. So for God, as Paul says, for God, who created out of nothing, it's a small thing only to call back into life what was at one time living but had died, because God is free. God is free over against the whole system of the world. God is free in sovereign majesty in a way that really boggles our minds. Thanks for being with us today. We are so glad you could join our discussion. 3 things to remember. First, Jesus is always with us and cares about us, even when it feels like he's absent. Second, Jesus calls us to trust him, even in the darkness. And finally, it's important to remember when we think about God that God is not one of us, just with a lot more power. God is outside the system of the world, not bound by the conditions under which we live. He is the Lord of those conditions. A very quick but important reminder. We are the church all together, and during this time we have to keep in mind that we are bound to one another in love. And so I want to urge you to take some time this week, call some church members, just check up on them, see how they're doing, see if they need anything. All of us need to be doing that. And remember, worship one, love all.
Hey guys, Pastor Jared here. I just wanted to thank you for joining us for our service. We'd like to know what you think. Give us your feedback. It would just be a great way for us to continue to learn how to do this better as we go through these next few weeks. Thanks.
Second, what's my second thing again?
Some continuity in the questioning.
I don't remember the question.
Well,